The Avengers vs. the Peter Factor Redo by midnightwolf2192. Chapter 2, Pepper. The first time Pepper heard about the Spider Kid was when Tony was sitting up in their bed watching videos on YouTube of the kid swinging around. "Who's that?" Pepper had asked as she rolled over to look at her boyfriend.
"Some new player, a vigilante working out of Queens,"
Tony had answered. The video showed the person swinging around and then catching a speeding car just before it ploughed into a bus.
"Imagine how strong this guy has to be!"
"Tony, it's 2 a.m. Go back to sleep. Your vigilante will be there in the morning," Pepper said fondly, and Tony, after some argument, put his Stark pad down and cuddled Pepper closer to him. The next time she heard about the Spider Kid was when Tony was in Berlin. She had been worried about his chances against Rogers and his little team, so had been trying to get all the information she could on whoever Tony had recruited.
"Pep, darling, everything will be alright,"
Tony said as they spoke the night before the showdown was due to happen.
"I have a little ace up my sleeve."
"Who, Tony?" Pepper had demanded, and Tony smiled.
"Spider-Man," Tony had replied.
And it was only after years of knowing Tony that Pepper knew exactly who he was talking about. The next time she had heard about Spider-Man had been when Happy had brought him up as a solution to Tony's depression during the Accords revamp. She had been naturally hesitant at first. Despite Jim and Happy's reassurances, she had no idea who this person, well, teenager as she soon discovered, was. She didn't know his motives, and knowing how secretive Tony was, probably wouldn't be able to find out unless she was told. But she needn't have worried. The first day that Spider Kid was due to arrive, Pepper had been surprised in her office after lunch by Jim. "Jim, what's wrong? Could you not get Tony out of his lab?" Pepper asked as Rhodey entered her office, but the smile on his face made her pause.
"Better than that, Pep. Not only did we have lunch together, and organise to have lunch again tomorrow, but he organised for Spider Kid to come by this afternoon. Then he went and shaved for the first time in days,"
Rhodey replied, and Pepper couldn't stop the grin from crossing her face.
"And on my way up here, Friday told me he had made his way down to the lab to clean it up."
"Well then, I am already indebted to this child," Pepper said with a fond smile.
"I think this is going to be good for him. He may actually take better care of himself if he has someone else looking up to him."
Rhodey replied,
"If it's alright with you, I'd like to stay for dinner tonight. Just to see how he is after some time spent with the kid."
"Of course, Jim. You never have to ask," Pepper replied. Rhodey stood and after kissing Pepper on the cheek, walked out of the office. "Friday?" Pepper called out softly once the door had closed behind Rhodey. "Yes, Miss Potts?" Friday's voice was calming and Pepper smiled. "Can you keep me updated on Tony's vitals once the kid arrives, please?" Pepper asked. "But don't let him know. This is just between us." "Of course, Mum," Friday replied before the AI fell silent. Normally, this might be considered spying, but for Pepper, it was about peace of mind. After all the shit Tony had been put through by people he had thought were his friends, like hell would she let anyone else hurt the man that she loved. He may put out an uncaring facade for the world to see, but deep down, Tony cared intensely. While ever Pepper was able, no one would harm Tony Stark on her watch again. The workday passed quickly, and at 3:30, Friday started sending updates through to Pepper about Tony. Pepper was happy to note that his vitals were steady, and in fact, his blood pressure and general heart rate had decreased in the time he was with the kid. Pepper turned off her computer at 6 and walked up to the penthouse. On her way up, she opened her phone and asked Friday to pull up footage from Tony's lab. She wasn't spying, not really. She was merely curious, and the sight that greeted her had her cooing slightly, though she would deny that if anyone asked. Tony was sitting at a holotable beside a teenager with curly brown hair. Both were talking animatedly with their hands and were pushing design elements back and forth between them. On the wall appeared to be a movie playing, and Friday explained that Tony and Peter were going to make a version of BB-8 from Star Wars. What made Pepper the happiest, though, was that Tony was smiling. Not his usual fake paparazzi smile, but an actual, genuine smile. This was the kind of smile that reached his eyes and made the crow's feet and wrinkles on his face even more pronounced. The smile that Tony had ever had on his face around Pepper, Happy, or Rhodey. Pepper had no more concerns about the kid. If he could make Tony this happy in such a short amount of time, he would always have a place in their home. Pepper decided to make dinner herself that night, instead of ordering out. So while she set about making lasagna, potato bake, and roast veggies, she had Friday play one of her Spotify playlists. Just as she was pulling dinner out of the oven at 8:30, Rhodey walked into the room.
"Papa, this smells amazing,"
Rhodey said as he kissed her on the cheek.
"Where's Tony?"
"Still downstairs with Peter," Pepper replied. "Could you go and get him while I finish serving up?" Rhodey left the room, and Pepper, wanting to see how this meeting would go, had Friday project the footage from the lab onto the wall. She couldn't help but laugh out loud as Peter called Rhodey Lieutenant Colonel Mr. War Machine Rhodes, sir. And for a moment she considered having Friday make that Rhodey's contact name on her phone, but she refrained. Barely. Pepper also found herself cooing again at the dejected looks on both Tony and Peter's faces when they realised their time was up. After Tony had invited Peter back the next day, Pepper turned the feed off and focused on dinner. When Tony and Rhodey arrived at the penthouse, Pepper could only smile and press a kiss to Tony's lips. This was the calmest she had seen him in months. The first time Pepper actually met Peter was different than anyone ever expected, but if you asked Pepper, she would say she wouldn't have wanted it any other way. Being in a relationship with Tony Stark meant that Pepper could generally cope with surprises. Surprises like Tony announcing he was working on getting the Avengers pardoned and getting the Accords changed, even after everything they had done to him. However, the sight of a teenage boy sitting under Tony's desk was a new one. Pepper was just getting ready to question the boy when she realised that he was deep in the grips of a panic attack. She dropped the paperwork she had for Tony to sign and approached the desk. "Hey, it's all right. You're safe here." Pepper generally knew how to talk to someone having a panic attack, thanks to her experiences with Tony. She started breathing deeply, hoping that the boy would catch on. "Match your breaths to mine." "Good job." It took a few minutes, but eventually the boy began to take in some deep breaths. "Good job. Now, let's try to ground you. Can you tell me 5 things you can see?" Pepper asked softly, keeping her tone and breathing even, so that the boy didn't become more agitated. "You, carpet, clouds, table leg, skyscraper," the boy panted out after a few tries. "Good. Now, 4 things you can feel," Pepper continued. Pepper coached the boy through all the grounding steps, and once he had finally finished, he opened his eyes and looked apologetically up at Pepper. "Wow! Oh, Miss Potts, ma'am. I'm so sorry," the boy spluttered out, and Pepper couldn't help the spark of affection that shot through her. "God, I'm so sorry. I'm so embarrassed." "You have nothing to be embarrassed about, sweetie," Pepper told him, "but I would like to know how you got up here." "I was in the lab working while Mr. Stark was looking at his emails. He got really mad at something and he started to yell. I guess I just went into sensory overload," the boy replied sheepishly. "I asked Friday to get me somewhere quiet, and I guess she led me here." "Well, Peter, why don't you and I head up to my office and you can sit with me? No one should be alone after such an intense panic attack," Pepper said as she got to her feet. "I'm sure you're super busy, Miss Potts. You've probably got much better things to be doing than taking care of a stupid kid who can't even handle a bit of yelling," Peter said self-deprecatingly as he rubbed the back of his neck. Peppa's heart broke a little at that, and she frowned. Peter climbed out from under the table, and Peppa was even more determined to help him. "Nonsense," Peppa said. She walked over to the dropped papers and, after putting them in a pile on Tony's desk, turned back to Peter. "Come on. Tony can shout for us for lunch. I think we've both earned it." She held her hand out, and after a moment Peter took it with a smile. The pair made their way to the elevator and travelled up to Peppa's office. When Tony found them, after eventually noticing Peter wasn't in the lab and asking Friday where his intern was, he smiled at the sight in front of him. Peppa and Peter were curled up on Peppa's couch, with Friday projecting Zootopia onto one of Peppa's blank walls. They had open containers of Indian food between them, and Tony softly asked Friday to take a picture of the scene. He joined them on the couch and helped himself to some of the food. Peter was pressed in between Peppa and Tony couldn't wipe the smile off his face as his intern cuddled closer to Peppa, while still keeping one hand in contact with Tony. When Peter finally left for the day, only after promising Peppa that he would come by again for another movie session, Peppa turned to her boyfriend and put her hands on her hips. "That boy is sunshine personified. When he is here, you let me know. Don't even think of keeping him locked away all for yourself. I will hurt you if you do," Peppa warned fiercely, and Tony could only smile. When Peter next arrived at Stark Tower, he was surprised when Friday took him up to level 78 rather than to the labs. Fry, what am I doing up here?" Peter asked as he exited the elevator. Level 78 was high-level offices, generally belonging to legal team and higher management figures. "Boss lady asked to see you before you lock yourself up in the lab," Friday replied, just as Peppa's head emerged from a room. "Hey, Peter," Peppa called out, and Peter smiled at the woman. He slowly walked down the hallway until he reached her office. "How are you today?" "I'm fine, thank you, Miss Potts," Peter replied. He knew that Peppa had told him to call her by her name, but there was no way he could do that. He had been raised right by Ben and May. "Did you need me for something?" "Not specifically. I did want your opinions on some things, though, if you don't mind," Peppa said as she led him into her office. She indicated for him to sit down, and he did so without complaint. "I was hoping to get some new perspective on Avengers Stark Industries is looking at investing in." "Why me? I mean, surely you have people whose job it is to do this?" Peter asked. He wasn't being disrespectful, simply curious. "Yes, but those people are all college students, or adults who have been working in their fields for many years. This venture is aimed more towards teenagers and getting them involved in STEM or medical opportunities, and I thought you might be the best person to bounce ideas off of." While Peter and Peppa spoke animatedly about the new venture, Tony was watching them through the security cameras. When Peter hadn't arrived at the lab after his arrival, Tony had been initially worried. But when Friday had explained that Peppa wanted to see him, Tony could only smile. As Peppa stepped forward and hugged Peter, Tony opened a locked file on the holotable. He placed another check mark on the board before shrinking the program. The Peter factor had claimed its second victim in Peppa Potts. And heaven help anyone that decided to attempt anything against someone with Peppa Potts in their corner. End of chapter. Hi guys, hope you enjoyed that one. Oh, I love that. Poor Peter with his little anxiety attack thing. Those things are not fun. I speak from experience. They are horrible. But I love how she grounds him, takes him by the hand, and just takes him up for food and Zootopia, which is just lovely. And she just almost immediately adopts him. Like, that's the running theme in this story, isn't it? Like, we're all aware of it, but still, it's really sweet. Anyway, you guys know the drill. Like, comment, and subscribe, and hit that bell to get notified whenever I upload a new video. Have a good day, night, or whatever time zone you're in. Bye, my guys, gals, and non-binary pals. I'll see you in another video. Take care.